Years later, when flames surrounded another car, his injured hands proved something that left the whole neighborhood in tears. Harold Jenkins stood at his apartment window, coffee mug trembling slightly in his wrinkled hand. Outside, construction workers tore down the old Thompson place, where Mary Thompson had lived for 40 years before moving to a nursing home last month. The rhythmic pounding of the demolition crew echoed through his small living room. "Progress," he muttered, taking a sip of his lukewarm coffee. The bitter taste matched his mood. A young couple walked past the construction site, pushing a stroller. They didn't even glance at the demolition, too absorbed in their phones. 5 years ago, you'd never see that on this street. Now it seemed like every month brought a new set of faces, younger faces, all of them staring at screens. The wall clock ticked to 8 a.m. Time for his pills. Harold shuffled to the kitchen, his arthritis making each step a careful calculation. The orange prescription bottles lined up like soldiers on his counter, their white caps a reminder of everything that didn't work like it used to. As he reached for the first bottle, a car horn blared outside. His hand jerked, sending pills scattering across the linoleum floor. The sound took him back instantly. The screech of tires, Martha's scream, the sickening crunch of metal. "Not now," Harold whispered, gripping the counter. His heart hammered against his ribs. He forced himself to breathe slowly, just like the grief counselor had taught him. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The memories came anyway. The intersection had been clear. He checked twice, like always. Martha was telling him about Sarah's new job in Boston. Then the truck ran the red light. He turned the wheel, but too slow. Always too slow. A knock at his door snapped him back to the present. Harold wiped his face, surprised to find it wet. The pills would have to wait. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Coming, coming," he called out, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The building manager, Kevin Chen, stood in the hallway. Young guy, maybe 30, always wearing those slim-fit suits that looked painted on. Today it was navy blue with brown shoes that probably cost more than Harold's monthly pension. "Mr. Jenkins," Kevin said, not quite meeting Harold's eyes. "Do you have a minute? There are some changes we need to discuss." Harold's stomach tightened. He'd seen this coming since the new management company bought the building 6 months ago. First, they'd upgraded the lobby with modern art that looked like scribbles. Then came the lifestyle amenities, a juice bar and yoga studio replacing the old community room where residents used to play cards. "Sure," Harold said, stepping back to let Kevin in. "Coffee?" "No, thanks. This won't take long." Kevin pulled a tablet from his leather briefcase. "As you know, we're making improvements to bring the building up to current market standards. Unfortunately, that means we need to adjust the rent structure." Harold sank into his armchair, the springs creaking in protest. "How much?" Kevin swiped his tablet screen. "Given your long-term resident status, we're limiting your increase to 30%, phased in over 6 months. Other units will see larger adjustments." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Harold did the math in his head. His current rent plus 30% would leave barely enough for food and medications, let alone the other bills. "That's more than my entire Social Security increase for the year," he said. Kevin's expression didn't change. "We understand this may create some hardship. There are several affordable senior living facilities in the suburbs that might be more suitable for your situation. I can provide a list." The demolition noise outside grew louder, as if emphasizing Kevin's point. Harold's hands clenched in his lap. "I've lived here for 30 years, he said quietly. "Martha and I raised our daughter here. The market doesn't care about history, Mr. Jenkins." Kevin stood, straightening his jacket. "The new rates take effect in 60 days. I'll email you the details." After Kevin left, Harold sat motionless in his chair, listening to the destruction outside. His toolkit sat on the shelf nearby, filled with wrenches and screwdrivers that had helped him earn extra money fixing things for neighbors. But lately his hands shook too much for delicate work. As if to prove the point, Mrs. Rodriguez from down the hall brought over her grandson's broken radio that afternoon. Harold's fingers fumbled with the tiny screws, sending one skittering under the refrigerator. "I'm sorry," he told her, handing back the still broken radio. "My arthritis." "No worries, Mr. Jenkins." Her smile was kind, but he saw the disappointment in her eyes. "My grandson can probably find a repair video online anyway." That evening, his daughter Sarah called. Harold could hear the worry in her voice before she even finished saying hello. Dad, have you thought more about moving to assisted living? There's a really nice place near me in Boston. Harold stared at the wall of family photos. Martha's smile frozen in time, Sarah's graduation, their last Christmas together as a family. I'm fine here, he said. Still got some fight left in me. That's not what I meant. I just worry about you being alone, especially with your hands getting worse. I said I'm fine. The words came out sharper than he'd intended. How's work going? They talked about safer topics for a few minutes before saying goodbye. Harold looked at his monthly bills spread across the kitchen table. Medical copris, utilities, pharmacy charges. The numbers refused to add up no matter how he arranged them. The evening news droned in the background as he made a simple dinner of soup and toast. A story about a fatal car crash downtown made him switch it off quickly, his hands shaking as he carried his bowl to the sink. That night, sleep refused to come. Harold lay in his too-large bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his changing neighborhood. Someone's bass-heavy music thumped through the walls. A group of young people laughed as they passed below his window, probably heading to the new craft brewery that replaced the old hardware store. The digital clock on his nightstand blinked 3:47 a.m. when he finally gave up on sleep. He moved to his living room chair, watching the streetlights cast shadows on his wall. In a few hours, the construction crews would return, tearing down more of the neighborhood he'd known for decades. The world kept moving forward, and Harold Jenkins felt increasingly like a relic being left behind. He dozed off as dawn approached, his dreams filled with screeching tires and Martha's voice calling his name. When he jerked awake, his chest tight with remembered panic, the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to paint the sky. Another day in a world that seemed to have less and less room for old men with shaking hands and fading skills. Little did Harold know, this ordinary morning would be anything but ordinary. The next few hours would test everything he thought he knew about his place in this changing world, and about his own capacity for courage in the face of overwhelming fear. Harold's morning routine started like any other. He shuffled to the kitchen at exactly 7:15 a.m., his slippers scraping against the worn linoleum. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the small apartment with the only smell that could still make him smile. Another day, he muttered to himself, pulling out his pill organizer. His fingers moved automatically through the familiar ritual: blood pressure pill, arthritis medication, heart tablets. The orange bottles rattled less than they used to. He'd need to call in refills soon. A horn honked outside, making him flinch. Even after 5 years, any sudden car noise sent his heart racing. He gripped the counter, waiting for the panic to pass. The wall calendar caught his eye. Sarah had marked her next visit in red ink. 2 weeks away. He touched the date gently, leaving a fingerprint in the dust. The sound hit without warning. A screech of tires, then a massive crash that rattled his windows. Harold's coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. For a moment, he stood frozen, coffee seeping into his slippers. Then he heard the screams. His legs carried him to the window before his mind could catch up. 3 stories below, a dark blue sedan had wrapped itself around a utility pole. The front end was crumpled like paper. Smoke curled from under the hood. No, Harold whispered. Not again. He recognized the car. It belonged to the new family that moved in last month, the Washingtons. They had a little boy, couldn't be more than 3. Harold had seen them coming and going, had nodded politely in the hallway, but never spoke. These days, he rarely spoke to anyone. The smoke thickened, turning an ugly black. A small flame licked out from under the hood. Harold's hands started shaking. He could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel, Mrs. Washington. She wasn't moving. In the back seat, something shifted. A small face appeared in the window, mouth open in a terrified cry. Someone help! A voice shouted from the street. There's a kid in there. Harold's feet felt bolted to the floor. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Memories crashed over him like waves. Martha trapped in their crushed car, him trying to reach her, the heat of flames. Please! The cry came again. Somebody do something! Through the window, Harold watched people gathering on the sidewalk. Some had their phones out, recording. Nobody moved toward the car. The flames grew higher. A child's scream cut through the morning air, high and terrified. It sliced straight through Harold's paralysis. God help me, he whispered. His legs were moving before he could think. Out his door, down the hallway, jabbing the elevator button with trembling fingers. Too slow, he muttered, heading for the stairs. His arthritic knees protested each step. The child screamed again. Harold burst out of the building's front door, gasping. The heat from the car hit him like a wall. Mrs. Washington was still slumped forward, but now he could see her chest moving. She was alive, but unconscious. The boy in the back. Harold searched his memory for the name. Marcus. That was it. Marcus was beating his small fists against the window, tears streaming down his face. The fire department's coming, someone in the crowd said. Should be here any minute. Harold looked at the flames, now eating their way toward the passenger compartment. Looked at the terror on Marcus's face. The boy couldn't be much older than his grandson would have been, if Sarah had ever had kids. Any minute will be too late, Harold said. His voice sounded strange in his ears, stronger than it had in years. The crowd parted as he moved forward. His arthritis screamed at him to stop. The heat made his eyes water. 5 steps from the car, memory and reality blurred. Martha trapped. Flames spreading. Him, frozen with fear, watching her die. Not this time, Harold growled. 4 steps. Someone grabbed his arm. Sir, you can't. It's too dangerous. Harold shook them off. 3 steps. The heat was incredible now. Sweat ran down his face. Marcus, he called. Marcus, can you hear me? The boy's eyes found his through the window. His small hand pressed against the glass. 2 steps. Harold could smell burning rubber, hot metal. His lungs burned with every breath. 1 step. He reached for the door handle, then yanked his hand back with a cry. The metal had heated to scalding temperatures. Behind him, sirens wailed in the distance. Too far. Way too far. Harold looked around frantically. There had to be something. His eyes landed on a brick lying in the construction debris near the sidewalk. Without letting himself think about it, he stumbled over and grabbed it. Stand back from the window, Marcus, he shouted. Cover your face. The boy pressed himself against the far side of his car seat. Harold raised the brick, trying to ignore how his shoulders protested the movement. Sir, please, someone yelled. You're too old for this. You'll kill yourself. Maybe they were right. His chest hurt. His joints felt like they were filled with broken glass. The heat was making him dizzy. But Marcus's terrified eyes locked onto his through the smoke, and Harold saw something there. Trust. This child who didn't even know his name was trusting him to help. The weight of those eyes felt heavier than the brick in his hand. Harold thought of Martha, of how he'd failed her, of all the nights he'd lain awake wishing he'd been braver, faster, stronger. A small explosion from under the hood made everyone jump. Flames licked at the windshield now. Time had run out. God forgive me if I mess this up, Harold whispered. Then he swung the brick at the rear window with every ounce of strength his 68-year-old body could muster. The glass spiderweb but didn't break. Harold's shoulders screamed in protest as he swung again. And again. On the 4th hit, the window finally shattered. Smoke poured out the opening. Harold dropped the brick and reached in. Ignoring the bite of broken glass against his arms, his fingers found Marcus's car seat. The buckles were hot to the touch. Harold's vision blurred with tears of pain as he fought with the straps. Behind him, the crowd had gone silent. The only sounds were the crackling flames, the distant sirens, and Marcus's terrified whimpers. It's okay, son, Harold said through gritted teeth. I've got you. I'm not leaving you. The words felt like a promise. Not just to Marcus, but to Martha, to himself, to every person he'd ever failed to help because he was too afraid, too weak, too old. As his bloody fingers struggled with the car seat buckles, Harold silently prayed for strength. He would need every bit of it for what was coming next. The car seat buckle burned Harold's fingers as he fumbled with the release mechanism. Sweat ran into his eyes, making them sting. The smoke was getting thicker. Come on, damn it, he muttered, his arthritic fingers refusing to work properly. Marcus had stopped crying, which scared Harold more than the screaming had. Hey, buddy, talk to me, Harold said, trying to keep his voice steady. What's your favorite toy? Marcus coughed. My dinosaur. Yeah. What color is he? Harold's fingers found the main buckle release. Green. Like trees. The buckle wouldn't budge. The plastic had partially melted from the heat, fusing it in place. Harold's heart pounded against his ribs. The fuel tank could go any second. Someone shouted from behind him. Get away from there. Harold ignored them. What's your dinosaur's name? Marcus. Rex. The boy's voice was getting weaker. The smoke burned Harold's lungs with every breath. He could barely see now. His shoulders and back screamed in protest as he leaned further through the broken window. A small explosion from under the hood made him flinch. The crowd gasped. Heat rolled over them in a wave. Sir! A woman's voice this time. The fire department is almost here. Please, get back. Harold's hands shook as he tried to think. The buckle was stuck. He couldn't see properly. His strength was failing. All the same problems as 5 years ago with Martha. You're too old, a voice in his head whispered. Too weak. You'll fail him just like you failed her. Marcus's small hand grabbed Harold's wrist. Please don't go. The touch sent a jolt through Harold's entire body. The boy's fingers were so tiny, so trusting. Without thinking, Harold covered Marcus's hand with his own. I'm not going anywhere, son. I promise. The words came out rough, but they cleared Harold's mind. He couldn't free the main buckle, but maybe. His fingers traced the straps to where they connected to the seat. The attachment points might be easier to release than the melted buckle. Marcus, can you be really brave for me? The boy nodded, his face streaked with tears and soot. Harold pulled his pocket knife out. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The blade caught the firelight as he started sawing at the first strap. What kind of games does Rex like to play? Harold asked, trying to keep Marcus focused on anything but the flames now licking at the front seats. Hide and seek. He's good at hiding. The first strap gave way. Harold moved to the second one, his arms burning from the awkward angle. Yeah. Where does he hide? Under my bed. Sometimes in the closet. Another small explosion rocked the car. Harold lost his grip on the knife. It clattered somewhere in the darkness of the back seat. No, no, no. Harold patted frantically around the seat, feeling for the knife. His fingers found nothing but hot plastic and fabric. The smoke was so thick now he could barely make out Marcus's face. The boy started coughing again, harsh racking sounds that shook his whole body. Harold made a decision. He got a grip on the partially cut strap and pulled with everything he had. His shoulders felt like they were being torn apart. Pain shot down his arms. Come on, he growled through clenched teeth. The strap held for a moment, then gave way with a sudden snap. Harold nearly fell backward. He caught himself on the car door, barely registering the heat that seared his palm. Now came the hard part. Harold took a deep breath of relatively clean air. Marcus, I'm going to pull you out. It might hurt a little, but you have to trust me. Can you do that? The boy nodded. Reaching out his arms, Harold got as good a grip as he could under Marcus's arms. The angle was awful. Glass from the broken window dug into his chest as he leaned in further. On 3. Okay. 1. Another explosion, bigger this time. The entire car shuddered. Tank's gonna blow, someone screamed. Harold didn't wait for 2 and 3. He pulled. Pain erupted across his back and shoulders. His knees threatened to buckle. Marcus's car seat caught on something. The boy cried out in pain. I'm sorry, Harold gasped. He shifted his grip and pulled again. This time Marcus came free. The sudden release sent Harold staggering backward. He lost his balance, turning at the last second to take the impact on his side rather than crush the boy. They hit the pavement hard. Harold felt something crack in his ribs. The pain was immediate and blinding. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Still clutching Marcus to his chest, Harold forced himself to his feet. His legs felt like rubber. Each breath sent daggers through his side. He stumbled away from the car, nearly falling again. Someone caught his elbow, helping him stay upright. They made it about 20 feet before the fuel tank exploded. The blast knocked them forward. Harold twisted as they fell, making sure Marcus landed on top of him. His head cracked against the pavement. Stars burst across his vision. For a moment, everything went quiet and dark. Harold floated in a haze of pain and confusion. Then the world came rushing back. Sirens screaming, people shouting, the crackle of flames, and a small voice right next to his ear. Mr. Harold, are you okay? Harold forced his eyes open. Marcus was kneeling beside him, his face smudged with soot but otherwise unharmed. Behind the boy, flames reached toward the sky where the car had been. You know my name. Harold managed. Marcus nodded. Mom says you fix things for people. And you're always alone. She says it's 'cause you miss someone. Harold's throat tightened. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his ribs stopped him with a gasp. Firefighters swarmed around them. Paramedics appeared with a stretcher. Someone was saying something about smoke inhalation and possible internal injuries. Harold didn't really hear them. He was looking at his hands, covered in cuts and burns. The same hands that had failed Martha 5 years ago. The hands he'd thought were too old, too weak to be of use anymore. Sir, we need to get you to the hospital. A paramedic was leaning over him. Mrs. Washington, Harold said. The driver. Is she? She's already on her way to the hospital. Looks like a concussion, but she'll be okay. Relief washed over Harold. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, he caught a glimpse of the crowd. Phones were still out, but they weren't just recording now. People were wiping their eyes, hugging each other. Mr. Chen, the building manager, stood at the front of the crowd. For once, his perfect suit was rumpled, and he was staring at Harold with something that looked like respect. Marcus refused to leave Harold's side as they loaded him into the ambulance. The boy held his hand the entire ride to the hospital, carefully avoiding the burns and cuts. Rex would like you, Marcus said as they pulled away from the scene. You're brave like a dinosaur. Harold tried to laugh, but it came out as a weak cough. Not brave, just too stubborn to quit. But even as he said it, Harold knew something had changed. The weight of Martha's death, the one he carried for 5 years, felt different now. Not gone, but lighter somehow. As the adrenaline faded and the pain medications began to take hold, Harold felt himself drifting. But for the first time in years, his dreams weren't filled with screeching tires and helpless regret. Instead, he dreamed of a little boy and his green dinosaur, playing hide-and-seek in a world where old men could still be heroes. The emergency room lights buzzed overhead as doctors worked on Harold's injuries. Every breath sent sharp pains through his ribs. His hands throbbed where they'd wrapped them in gauze. 2 cracked ribs, the doctor said, examining the x-rays. Multiple lacerations and second-degree burns on both hands. Mild smoke inhalation. She lowered the chart and looked at Harold. You're lucky it wasn't worse. Harold barely heard her. His mind kept replaying the rescue, searching for moments where he could have been faster, stronger, better. Mr. Jenkins. The doctor's voice pulled him back. Are you experiencing any confusion? Headache? No. Just tired. Harold winced as she pressed gently on his ribs. How's the boy? And his mother? Marcus is fine. Some smoke inhalation, minor scratches. Mrs. Washington has a concussion but should make a full recovery. The doctor made some notes on her tablet. They're both asking about you. A nurse came in with more bandages. As she rewrapped Harold's hands, the TV in the corner caught his attention. His stomach dropped when he saw the footage. Someone had recorded the entire rescue on their phone. There he was, stumbling toward the burning car, breaking the window, pulling Marcus out. The explosion at the end made him flinch. You're trending on social media, the nurse said, smiling. Local hero and all that. Harold looked away from the screen. I'm no hero. Just did what needed doing. The nurse finished with his bandages. Well, there's a waiting room full of people who'd disagree with you. Half the building's out there. Before Harold could respond, Sarah burst into the room. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying. Dad! She rushed to his bedside, then stopped short, afraid to hug him. I caught the first flight when Mr. Chen called. What were you thinking? Sarah, I'm fine. Fine? Look at you. She gestured at his bandaged hands, the monitors, the oxygen tube in his nose. You could have been killed, but I wasn't. Harold met his daughter's eyes. I couldn't just watch, Sarah. Not again. Not like with Mom. Sarah's anger crumpled. She sat carefully on the edge of his bed, taking one of his bandaged hands in hers. I know, she whispered. I know, Dad. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus's father stood there, still in his business suit, looking like he'd aged 10 years since morning. Mr. Jenkins. His voice was rough with emotion. May I come in? Harold nodded. Mr. Washington crossed the room in 3 long strides and grasped Harold's shoulder gently. I don't even know how to begin thanking you, he said. If you hadn't been there, anyone would have done the same, Harold said. But they didn't. Everyone just stood there filming. Except you. Mr. Washington's grip tightened slightly. My son keeps asking when he can see his dinosaur friend again. Despite the pain, Harold smiled. How is he? Amazingly okay. Keeps telling everyone how brave you were. Mr. Washington pulled out his phone. Look. The screen showed Marcus in his hospital bed, clutching a stuffed green dinosaur. He was grinning at the camera, giving a thumbs up. The nurses gave him that dinosaur, Mr. Washington explained. He named it Harold. Something warm and unexpected spread through Harold's chest, pushing back some of the pain. The day passed in a blur of doctors, nurses, and visitors. Kevin Chen stopped by, awkwardly holding a fruit basket. About the rent increase, he said, not quite meeting Harold's eyes. We'll be re-evaluating that policy. Mrs. Rodriguez came with homemade soup. For when you're home, she said. And my grandson says he can wait for his radio to be fixed. No rush. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep in Harold's bones. The pain medication made everything fuzzy around the edges. Sarah had gone to his apartment to get some clothes and toiletries. As Harold drifted in and out of sleep, memories mixed with the day's events. But this time, when he saw the flames and heard the screams, something was different. This time, he wasn't frozen. This time, his hands, though old and shaking, had been strong enough. A nurse came in to check his vitals. Try to get some rest, Mr. Jenkins. Big day tomorrow. Tomorrow. The media's been calling non-stop. Everyone wants to interview the hero who saved that little boy. Harold shook his head slightly. Don't feel much like a hero. The nurse adjusted his fall. You know what my grandmother used to say? A hero isn't someone who isn't afraid. A hero is someone who's terrified but does what needs doing anyway. As she left, Harold looked at his bandaged hands in the dim light. They hurt, but it was different from his usual arthritis pain. This pain felt earned somehow. His phone buzzed on the bedside table. With some effort, he managed to pick it up. A text from an unknown number showed a photo of Marcus sound asleep, the green dinosaur tucked under his arm. He insisted Harold the dinosaur needed to sleep in his bed tonight. The message read, says brave dinosaurs keep the bad dreams away. Harold's vision blurred. He thought of all the nights he'd lain awake, haunted by Martha's accident, feeling useless and out of place in a world that seemed to have no room for old men. But today, when it mattered most, those same old hands had been exactly what was needed. A commotion in the hallway drew his attention. Through his half-open door, he could see reporters gathering, held back by hospital security. Just a few questions, Mr. Jenkins. Can you tell us what was going through your mind? How does it feel to be a hero? Harold closed his eyes, letting their voices fade into background noise. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a tired old man with cracked ribs and burned hands. But maybe that was enough. Sarah returned, carrying his overnight bag. She took one look at the crowd in the hallway and closed the door firmly. Want me to get rid of them? She asked. Harold shook his head. Let them wait. Story's not going anywhere. She helped him sit up, adjusting his pillows. Her hands were gentle, but he could feel them trembling slightly. I was so scared when I heard, she said quietly. But I was proud too. Really proud. Your mother would have done the same, Harold said. She always was the brave one. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. You both were. Ow. She pulled something from the bag. Look what I found in your closet. It was Martha's old photo album. Harold hadn't opened it since the accident. His bandaged fingers brushed the worn cover. Maybe. Sarah hesitated. Maybe it's time to remember the good things too. Not just the end. Harold looked at the album, then at his hands. The same hands that had failed Martha were the ones that had saved Marcus. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to remember differently. As the pain medication pulled him toward sleep, Harold thought he heard Martha's voice, soft and clear as a bell. You did good, old man. You did real good. Morning brought a fresh wave of pain and a room full of reporters. Harold sat up in his hospital bed, trying not to wince as his ribs protested. Sarah stood by his side, deflecting the more intrusive questions. Mr. Jenkins, what motivated you to risk your life? A reporter in the front held her microphone closer. Harold looked down at his bandaged hands. There wasn't time for motivation. The car was burning. The boy was trapped. That's all. But at your age, surely you realize the danger. My age? Harold's voice grew sharp. You think fear of dying matters when a child's screaming for help. The room fell silent. A photographer's camera clicked softly. I'm just an old man, Harold continued, softer now. My hands shake. My joints ache. But yesterday, that didn't matter much. More questions followed, but Harold barely heard them. His mind kept drifting to Martha, to Marcus, to flames and fear and choices made in split seconds. A nurse finally cleared the room, citing hospital policy. Sarah helped Harold stand, his muscles stiff from lying in bed. They're calling you the hero of Hampton Street on the news, she said, adjusting his robe. I told them, I'm no hero. Dad. Sarah stopped adjusting and looked him in the eye. You ran into a burning car to save a child. That's pretty much the dictionary definition of hero. Before Harold could argue, a small whirlwind burst into the room. Marcus Washington ran straight to Harold's bed, his mother following more slowly, her head bandaged. Mr. Harold, look. Marcus held up his green dinosaur. The nurses gave him a bandage too, just like yours. Sure enough, the stuffed dinosaur's arm sported a white gauze wrap. Harold felt his throat tighten. Mrs. Washington stepped forward, her eyes wet. Mr. Jenkins, I don't even know where to begin. Marie, Harold interrupted. Please. Just Harold. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Harold, the doctors told me what you did. How you got Marcus out just before. Her voice broke. Marcus climbed carefully onto Harold's bed, mindful of the tubes and wires. Mom says you're super brave. Like a superhero. But better 'cause you're real. Harold looked at the boy he'd pulled from the flames. No smoke stains now, no tears. Just a bright-eyed kid with a bandaged dinosaur. Want to know a secret? Harold leaned closer. I was scared the whole time. Marcus's eyes widened. Really? But you saved me anyway. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared. Mrs. Washington touched Harold's arm gently. The insurance company declared the car a total loss. They said the fuel tank explosion, if you hadn't gotten him out when you did. Marie. Harold covered her hand with his bandaged one. Don't. He's safe. That's what matters. A doctor came in with Harold's discharge papers. As Sarah helped with the paperwork, Marcus showed Harold all the features of his dinosaur. He roars. See. Marcus pressed a button, producing a tinny growl. And his eyes glow in the dark. Want to hold him? Harold carefully took the stuffed animal. The fabric was soft, nothing like the burning metal and melted plastic he'd touched yesterday. You're good with him, Marie said softly. Do you have grandchildren? No. Harold handed the dinosaur back to Marcus. Sarah's focused on her career. Nothing wrong with that. Well, you've got one honorary grandson now. Marie smiled. If you want. Before Harold could respond, Kevin Chen appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes rather than his usual suit. Mr. Jenkins. Good to see you up. He shifted his weight. Could we talk privately for a moment? Sarah started to object, but Harold waved her off. It's fine. Once the others had stepped out, Kevin cleared his throat. The building owners saw the news coverage. They've reconsidered their position on the rent increases. Have they now? Yes. In fact, they'd like to offer you a lifetime lease at your current rate. And they're upgrading your unit. New appliances, better heating system. Harold looked at his building manager's carefully blank expression. Worried about bad publicity? Are they? They're worried about doing right by a man who just showed more courage than anyone they've ever met. Kevin met Harold's eyes for the first time. And so am I. I was wrong about you, Mr. Jenkins. About a lot of things. A nurse came in with a wheelchair. Hospital policy for discharge. No exceptions. As they helped Harold into it, his ribs complaining, Marcus ran back in. Wait. Harold the dinosaur wants to come home with you. To protect you from bad dreams. Marie started to object, but Harold held up his hand. I'd be honored, but only if you'll come visit him sometimes. Marcus's face lit up. Every day. I'll bring my other dinosaurs too. As they wheeled Harold toward the exit, reporters clustered again, shouting questions. But Harold barely noticed them. He was watching Marcus walk alongside his wheelchair, chattering about dinosaurs and bravery and how his dad was going to help fix Harold's hands so he could work on radios again. Sarah drove them home, the stuffed dinosaur secure in Harold's lap. The street was almost back to normal, just some scorch marks on the pavement where the car had burned. The local news wants to do a feature story, Sarah said as she helped him into his apartment. About your life, your history as a mechanic, everything. Harold sank into his armchair, exhausted. Why would anyone care about that? Because people need heroes, Dad. Real ones. Not celebrities or politicians. Just ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Harold looked around his small apartment. Everything was exactly as he'd left it yesterday morning. Coffee cups still in the sink. Pills still lined up on the counter. Martha's photos still on the wall. But something had changed. The walls didn't feel quite so confining. The silence wasn't quite so heavy. A text message chimed on his phone. Marie had sent another picture. Marcus showing his other dinosaurs how to be brave like Mr. Harold. You know, Harold said slowly. Maybe I could teach him some basic mechanics when my hands heal. Kids should know how things work. Sarah smiled. I think he'd like that. Later that night, Harold lay in bed, his ribs aching despite the pain medication. The stuffed dinosaur sat on his nightstand, its eyes glowing softly in the dark. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't see flames when he closed his eyes. Instead, he saw Marcus's face, trusting and determined. Heard Martha's voice, not in fear but in pride. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe the world did need heroes. Not the kind in capes and masks, but the kind with shaking hands and creaky joints who did what needed doing anyway. Tomorrow would bring more reporters, more questions, more pain as his body healed. But for now, Harold Jenkins, the reluctant hero of Hampton Street, slept peacefully under the watchful eyes of a glowing green dinosaur. And somewhere, he was sure, Martha was smiling. The first week home from the hospital passed in a blur of pain medication and visitors. Harold's apartment, usually so quiet, buzzed with constant activity. Sarah had extended her stay, sleeping on his old couch despite his protests. Your ribs aren't healed, she'd say whenever he objected. And your hands still need time. On Tuesday morning, Harold sat at his kitchen table, struggling with a piece of toast. His bandaged hands made even simple tasks frustrating. Let me help. Sarah reached for the butter knife. I can manage. Harold's voice came out sharper than he'd intended. The knife slipped, sending the toast skidding across the table. A knock at the door interrupted his frustration. Sarah opened it to find Marcus and his father standing there. Is Mr. Harold awake? Marcus clutched a large paper bag. We brought breakfast. Mr. Washington held up a drink carrier with coffee cups. Marie's famous pancakes. She insisted. The smell of warm syrup filled the apartment as they unpacked the food. Marcus carefully arranged everything on the table, his face serious with concentration. Mom made extra because she says when you're healing, you need good food. He pointed to each container. These ones have blueberries. These have chocolate chips. And these are plain, but that's okay too. Harold looked at his bandaged hands. Might need some help with those. I can cut them. Marcus grabbed a plastic fork. Dad showed me how to do it neat and careful. Mr. Washington, please, call me James, sat down with them. How are the hands feeling? Doctors say they are healing well. Another week of bandages, then physical therapy. Harold watched Marcus methodically cutting the pancakes into bite-sized pieces. The ribs are the worst part. The whole neighborhood's been asking about you, James said. That video of the rescue went viral. Over 5 million views now. Harold shifted uncomfortably. Don't see why. Just did what anyone would do. But that's just it. Nobody else did. James leaned forward. Everyone stood there filming. Only you acted. Marcus finished cutting the pancakes and pushed the plate toward Harold. Careful. They're still hot. Like the car was, but not bad hot. Good hot. Harold saw Sarah tense at the casual mention of the fire. But Marcus seemed completely at ease. Kids were resilient that way. Thank you, Marcus. These look perfect. They ate together, Marcus chattering about school and his dinosaur collection. It felt normal, like family breakfasts used to feel, before Martha. After breakfast, James cleared his throat. There's something else we wanted to discuss. The insurance company's settlement came through yesterday. That's good, Harold said. For the car. Yes, but also. James pulled out an envelope. They want to cover your medical bills. All of them. Including the physical therapy. Harold started to protest, but James held up his hand. Please, let us do this. It's the least we can do. Before Harold could respond, another knock came at the door. Kevin Chen stood there with 2 maintenance workers. Mr. Jenkins, we're ready to start the upgrades we discussed. New heating system, appliances, bathroom renovation. He glanced at Harold's hands. Though we can wait if the noise would be too much. No. Harold surprised himself with how firm his voice sounded. No more waiting. Time for changes. The next few hours brought a stream of workers measuring, planning, and explaining the improvements. Marcus watched everything with fascination, asking endless questions about tools and techniques. "Mr. Harold," he asked during a quiet moment, "when your hands get better, will you teach me how to fix things?" The question caught Harold off guard. He looked at his bandaged hands, then at the boy's eager face. "You really want to learn?" Marcus nodded vigorously. "Dad says you used to fix everybody's stuff. He says you know how everything works." "Used to," Harold said softly. "These old hands aren't as steady as they once were. But they were strong enough when it mattered," James said quietly. Another knock interrupted them. Mrs. Rodriguez stood there with her grandson Tommy, the broken radio in hand. "We thought maybe." She gestured to the radio. "When you're better, of course. Tommy wants to learn how it works." Harold looked at the two boys, Marcus with his dinosaur, Tommy with his radio, both watching him with expectant eyes. "You know," he said slowly, "maybe we could learn together. When the hands heal. Make it a proper class." Marcus's face lit up. "Like a fix-it school?" "Something like that." Harold felt a smile tugging at his lips. These young hands could help these old ones steady. The idea took hold quickly. By afternoon, 3 more families had asked about the fix-it class. Sarah started making lists of supplies they'd need. "Dad," she said later, after everyone had left, "I've been thinking, maybe I could transfer to the Boston office's local branch. Be closer to home." Harold looked at his daughter. "You love your job in Boston. I love you more." She touched his bandaged hand gently. "This week made me realize how much I've missed." That evening, Harold sat in his chair, looking at the changes happening in his apartment. Workers had left tools and materials neatly stacked, ready for tomorrow. Martha's photos watched over it all. His phone buzzed with a text from Marie, another picture of Marcus, this time showing his dinosaurs the basic tools he'd learned about today. "He says they need to practice for fix-it school," the message read. "Hope that's still okay." Harold looked at his hands. The burns still hurt. The cuts still stung. But for the first time in years, he could imagine them steady again. Useful again. His ribs ached as he reached for his old toolbox, but he pulled it onto his lap anyway. Inside, decades of expertise waited in well-worn wrenches and screwdrivers. "What do you think, Martha?" he said to the quiet room. "Ready to pass it all on?" The stuffed dinosaur's eyes glowed softly from his nightstand, as if in answer. Later that night, Sarah found him asleep in his chair, the toolbox open in his lap, a content smile on his face. She covered him with a blanket and kissed his forehead. "Love you, Dad," she whispered. In his dreams, Harold's hands were strong and sure again. But this time, they weren't just fixing things. They were building something new. 2 weeks after the rescue, doctors removed Harold's bandages. His hands looked strange to him now, pink scars crisscrossing the wrinkled skin. But the burns had healed better than expected. "Try moving your fingers," the doctor said. Harold flexed them slowly. The skin felt tight, but the pain had dulled to a manageable ache. His arthritis actually bothered him more than the healing burns. "Good range of motion," the doctor made notes on her tablet. "The physical therapy is helping. Keep up with the exercises." Outside the examination room, Sarah waited with Marcus and Marie. The boy had insisted on coming to every doctor's appointment, bringing his dinosaur for moral support. "Look." Harold showed them his unbandaged hands. "Almost good as new." Marcus studied them carefully. "The scars look like dinosaur scratches. That means they're extra strong now." Marie squeezed Harold's shoulder. "How do they feel?" "Stiff, but working." He wiggled his fingers at Marcus, making the boy giggle. "Maybe ready to start those fix-it lessons soon." The waiting room had changed over the past 2 weeks. Where there used to be just outdated magazines, now there was a small table with children's books. Many featured dinosaurs. "The nurses set it up," Sarah explained, following his gaze. "They say Marcus has spent so much time here, he needed his own reading corner." Walking out to the parking lot, Harold noticed his stride was stronger. His ribs had healed enough that breathing didn't hurt, and the regular physical therapy had improved his overall mobility. "Dad?" Sarah held up his car keys. "Want to drive?" Harold stared at the keys. He hadn't driven since Martha's accident. The thought still made his heart race. I. He started to refuse, then saw Marcus watching him. Mom says sometimes we have to do scary things, the boy said. Like when you helped me from the car. But you did it anyway. Harold took the keys, his newly healed hands trembling slightly. You're pretty smart for a little guy. You know that. The drive home was tense but uneventful. Harold white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole way, but each mile got a little easier. By the time they pulled into his apartment building's parking lot, his hands had stopped shaking. You did it. Marcus bounced in his seat. See? Brave like a dinosaur. The building looked different now. The renovation crews had been busy. New windows gleamed in the sunlight, and the lobby sparkled with fresh paint. But the biggest change was the ground floor community room. Where the yoga studio had been, workbenches now lined the walls. Basic tools hung on pegboards, and several old radios sat ready for repair. A hand-painted sign read, Mr. Harold's Fix-It School. Kevin organized it, Sarah said. The whole building pitched in. Got a waiting list of students already, Marie added. Seems lot of kids want to learn from the hero of Hampton Street. Harold grimaced at the title, but he had to admit the setup looked professional. Someone had even installed better lighting and cushioned floor mats to make standing easier on old knees. As they entered his apartment, Harold's phone buzzed. A text from James Washington. Committee approved your idea. Starting next month, all building maintenance staff required to give basic repair lessons to interested residents. You've started something good here. The apartment had changed too. New appliances gleamed in the kitchen. The heating system worked properly now. No more rattling pipes. But Martha's photos still watched from the walls, now joined by new ones. Harold in his hospital bed with Marcus and the dinosaur. Sarah helping him with physical therapy. Marie bringing over home-cooked meals. Big day tomorrow, Sarah said, setting up his therapy exercises. First official fix-it class. Harold flexed his healing hands. You think I can still do it? Teach them properly? Dad. Sarah took his hands in hers, looking at the scars. These hands saved a life. Pretty sure they can handle a broken radio or two. That evening, after everyone had left, Harold sat in his chair looking at his hands in the fading light. The scars would fade with time, the doctor said, but never completely disappear. He was okay with that. A knock at his door surprised him. Kevin Chen stood there, looking nervous. Mr. Jenkins. Got a minute? Harold gestured him in. Kevin held out a folder. The final paperwork for your lifetime lease. And something else. Harold opened the folder. Behind the lease was another document, a job offer. Building's resident maintenance advisor, Kevin explained. Teaching repair skills, overseeing the Fix-It School, consulting on renovations. Paid position, part-time hours, full benefits. Harold stared at the paper. Why me? Because you know this building better than anyone. Because the residents trust you. And because. Kevin straightened his tie. Because sometimes we need to be reminded what real value looks like. After Kevin left, Harold called Sarah. They offered me a job, he said when she answered. That's wonderful. What are you going to do? Harold looked at his hands, at the scars that proved they were still strong enough when it mattered. I think Martha would want me to take it. She'd be proud, Dad. Really proud. That night, Harold dreamed of Martha again. But this time, instead of the accident, he dreamed of their early days. How she believed in him when he'd first started fixing things. How she'd always said his hands were magic, could make broken things whole again. He woke to sunrise painting his walls gold. His phone showed multiple text messages. From Tommy, can't wait for Fix-It School. From Marie, Marcus has his toolbox ready. From James, thank you for giving our kids something real to believe in. Harold got up, made his coffee, and took his pills. Same morning routine, but everything felt different. His hands didn't shake as much. His steps felt lighter. In the community room, he started setting up for the day's first class. The tools felt right in his hands, like old friends welcoming him back. Marcus arrived early, clutching his dinosaur and a tiny toolbox his father had bought him. Ready to learn, Mr. Harold? Harold looked at his scarred hands, then at the boy who'd helped him find his strength again. You know what, Marcus? I think I am. 1 month after starting the Fix-It School, Harold's morning routine had completely transformed. Instead of silent coffee and pills, his kitchen buzzed with activity. Sarah, who'd officially transferred to the local office, made breakfast while reviewing the day's class schedule. Tommy's group at 10, basic electronics, she read from her tablet. Then Marcus and the beginners at 2. Harold flexed his hands. The scars had faded to silvery lines, and the physical therapy had worked wonders. He could handle small screwdrivers again, though some days were better than others. Getting pretty full, he said, watching her add names to the waiting list. Dad, you're turning kids away at this point. Maybe we should add another class. Before he could answer, a knock at the door announced Marcus's early arrival. The boy burst in, waving a paper. Mr. Harold, look what I got on my science test. Harold studied the paper, noting the large red A+ at the top. The test questions covered simple machines and basic mechanics. Well, would you look at that? He grinned. All that wrench turning paying off? Marcus beamed. Teacher says I explained everything perfect. Even about leverage and fulcrums. Sarah ruffled the boy's hair. Pretty soon you'll be teaching the class yourself. No way. Marcus shook his head firmly. Mr. Harold's the best teacher. But maybe I could be his assistant. The idea stuck. By afternoon, Harold had created a junior assistant program. Kids who mastered basic repairs could help teach newcomers under his supervision. It's brilliant, Marie said when she picked up Marcus later. They learn leadership while reinforcing their own skills. The community room had evolved too. Residents donated old appliances and electronics for repair practice. Local hardware stores, hearing about the program, contributed tools and materials. Even Kevin Chen got involved, attending classes himself. Property management's more than paperwork, he admitted during a lesson on basic plumbing. Should know how things actually work. Word spread beyond the building. A local news crew showed up to film a segment about the Hampton Street Fix-It Academy, as people had started calling it. Mr. Jenkins, the reporter asked, did you ever imagine your act of heroism would lead to all this? Harold looked around at the busy workshop. Tommy was showing a younger kid how to test a circuit. Marcus demonstrated proper screwdriver technique to a new student. Never imagined any of it, he answered honestly. Just did what needed doing. That evening, Harold visited Martha's grave for the first time since the rescue. Sarah had offered to come, but this felt like something he needed to do alone. He sat on the bench near her headstone, letting the quiet settle around him. You should see it, Martha, he said softly. These kids, they're something else. Eager to learn, eager to help. He touched the scars on his hands. Remember how you always said everything happens for a reason? A warm breeze rustled the flowers he brought. Maybe you were right. Maybe I needed to save Marcus so he could help save me. Walking back to his car, Harold's phone buzzed. A text from James Washington included a photo of Marcus's science test hung proudly on their fridge. He says it's all thanks to you. The message read. We all say that a lot these days. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. The building's owner, Patricia Chen, Kevin's mother. Mr. Jenkins, she said, settling into his kitchen chair. My son tells me you've revolutionized our community engagement program. Harold poured her coffee. Just teaching kids basic repairs, Mrs. Chen. You're teaching them far more than that. She pulled out a folder. Which is why I'm here. We'd like to expand the program to our other properties. The proposal outlined a comprehensive education initiative. Fix-It schools in every building, with Harold as lead curriculum developer and trainer. Full salary, benefits, travel expenses when needed. Patricia watched him read. Plus complete autonomy in program development. Harold set down the papers. Why me? Because you understand something my company forgot. Buildings aren't just property. They're communities. She smiled. And sometimes communities need more than new paint and fancy amenities. Later that day, during the afternoon class, Harold watched Marcus help a younger student understand gear ratios using toy dinosaurs as teaching aids. See? Marcus pointed to the interlocking plastic teeth. When this one turns slow and strong, like Mr. Harold's hands, it makes the little one turn fast and smooth. They work together to make things better. The explanation was childish but perfectly accurate. Harold felt something warm spread through his chest. Speaking of working together, Sarah said, coming up beside him. When should I list my condo in Boston? Figure I should start looking for a place here. Harold turned to her, surprised. You're really staying? Dad, look around. She gestured to the busy workshop. You've built something amazing here. something that matters. I want to be part of it. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. His mind kept spinning with possibilities. The programs they could develop, the skills they could teach, the communities they could help rebuild. He got up and went to his workbench, where a half-repaired radio waited. His hands, strong and steady now, moved through the familiar motions of testing connections and replacing worn parts. A soft knock at his door revealed Marcus in pajamas, clutching his dinosaur. "Mom said you might be up," the boy said. "I had a bad dream about the fire." Harold set down his tools. "Want to help me fix this radio?" "Usually helps me with bad dreams." They worked together quietly, Harold guiding Marcus's small hands through the repairs. When the radio finally crackled to life, playing soft music, the boy smiled. "You know what, Mr. Harold? My dad says sometimes broken things come back stronger. Like your hands. Like me after the fire." Harold looked at his scarred hands, then at this child who'd somehow helped him rebuild not just his life, but an entire community. "Your dad's a smart man, Marcus. A really smart man." 6 months after the car fire, Hampton Street looked different. The old construction sites had transformed into modern apartments. But with a twist, each building now featured a ground-floor workshop space, modeled after Harold's original Fix-It school. Harold stood in his classroom, watching the morning light stream through new windows. The scars on his hands had faded to thin silver lines, barely visible unless you knew where to look. "Big day," Sarah said, entering with 2 coffee cups. She handed one to her father. "Just a ceremony," Harold muttered, but his hand trembled slightly as he took the coffee. "Just a ceremony?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Dad, the mayor's coming. They are naming the program after you." The Jenkins Community Education Initiative would launch today, expanding the Fix-It school model across the city. Harold still couldn't quite believe it. Marcus burst in, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and carrying his trusty dinosaur. "Mr. Harold, Mom says to come to the courtyard." Everyone's waiting. The building's courtyard had been transformed. Rows of chairs faced a small stage. Banners celebrated 6 months since the rescue, though Harold had asked them not to make a big deal about that part. Kevin Chen approached as Harold took his seat in the front row. "Nervous?" Kevin straightened Harold's tie. "Don't be. Just be yourself. That's what changed everything in the first place." The ceremony began. The mayor spoke about community renewal and the power of practical education. Patricia Chen detailed the initiative's plans for expansion. Then James Washington took the podium. 6 months ago, I almost lost my son," he began. A retired mechanic with shaking hands and a bad back ran into a burning car to save him. Everyone said he was too old, too weak. But Harold Jenkins proved that courage doesn't age, and strength isn't just about muscle. Harold felt Sarah squeeze his hand as James continued. But the real miracle wasn't just the rescue. It's what happened after. This man took his second chance and used it to give hundreds of kids their first chance at learning real skills, building real confidence. Marcus, sitting on Harold's other side, clutched his dinosaur tightly. "Today, we're not just celebrating a hero," James said. "We're celebrating what happens when one person refuses to believe they're too old, too weak, or too anything to make a difference." The applause washed over Harold like a wave. Sarah helped him to his feet, guided him toward the stage. His hands didn't shake as he gripped the podium. The faces before him were familiar now: students, parents, neighbors. "Community. Don't really have a speech prepared," he started. "Never been much good at talking. Better with my hands." A gentle laugh rippled through the crowd. 6 months ago, I thought I was finished. Used up. World was changing too fast, leaving folks like me behind. He looked at his scarred hands. Then life gave me a choice. Sit and watch, or do something. Marcus beamed up at him from the front row. "These kids taught me something important. Every time we fix something broken, we fix a little bit of ourselves too. Every skill we pass on builds something stronger than just knowledge. It builds hope." Harold gestured to the workshop behind him. "This place isn't about making mechanics. It's about making believers. Believers in second chances, in the value of work, in the strength we all have inside us." His voice grew stronger. 6 months ago, I couldn't hold a screwdriver steady. Now I'm teaching kids to rebuild engines. 6 months ago, I was alone in my apartment. Now I can't get 5 minutes of quiet. More laughter, knowing and warm. And you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way. After the ceremony, people lingered in the courtyard. Kids showed off their repair projects to proud parents. Sarah handled interview requests from local media. Marie Washington brought over a cake shaped like a toolbox. Marcus designed it, she said. Insisted the tools had to be anatomically correct. Harold chuckled. Kids getting particular about his details. Wonder where he gets that from. Marie smiled. You've changed him, you know. Changed all of us. Later, in the quiet of his apartment, Harold sat in his chair looking at Martha's photo. Wish you could see this, he said softly. She can, Sarah said from the doorway. She always could. That evening, they held a smaller celebration in the workshop. Students demonstrated their skills for family members. Marcus, now the head junior assistant, gave a tour to visiting educators. See, the important thing about fixing stuff, Harold overheard him telling them, isn't just knowing how. It's believing you can. Mr. Harold taught us that. Tommy showed off his latest project. The radio that Harold couldn't fix 6 months ago, now working perfectly. Ready for the next class? Sarah asked, checking her tablet. Harold looked around the room. At Kevin Chen discussing building maintenance with a group of residents. At Patricia Chen watching students demonstrate basic wiring. At James Washington filming his son explaining gear ratios to a newcomer. At all the lives touched, all the connections made, all because he'd chosen to reach through flames instead of standing back. You know what? Harold flexed his scarred hands. I think I'm ready for anything. That night, after everyone had gone, Harold stood in his workshop. Tools lined the walls, each in its proper place. Student projects sat in various stages of completion. A new sign hung above his workbench. It's never too late to make a difference. Marcus had made it in shop class, the letters carefully routed into wood. Harold's phone buzzed. A text from James. Marcus says he forgot Harold Jr. in the workshop. Says he can't sleep without him watching over things. Harold smiled, spotting the green dinosaur sitting on a shelf. But he didn't pick it up. Some things, he'd learned, needed to stay in the workshop. Standing guard, reminding them all that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't the rescue, it was what came after. The choice to keep going, keep teaching, keep believing. Harold turned off the lights, but left the dinosaur in place. In the DAC, its eyes glowed softly, watching over the tools and projects and possibilities waiting for tomorrow. Tomorrow, when shaking hands would grow steady again. When old skills would find new purpose. When a retired mechanic with silver scars would show another group of kids that it's never too late to fix what's broken. In machines, in communities, in ourselves. Harold Jenkins closed the workshop door, but he didn't lock it. Some places needed to stay open, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.